I am thrilled to be here. This is my fourth South by Southwest, and I have to say that I have seen the convention completely change right before my eyes. I remember when we were first here a couple years ago, people would walk in and you would just see one or two people of color, a couple of women, and now every time I walk in, it's a completely different experience. And I think it's a testament to the work that Tammy has done at South by Southwest and Alicia to make sure that there are diverse voices coming in. And I think it also demonstrates where we are as a country, because we're changing quickly. When I started with Voto Latino 11 years ago, people thought that we were absolutely nuts, because we wanted to reach out to the fastest growing group of Americans using English, technology, and we wanted to go online, and we wanted to use pop culture. And people thought we were absolutely nuts. But I didn't think we were nuts, because I realized that we were speaking to a generation of Americans that had never been heard out loud that they were American. They were speaking to my experience. I grew up in Sonoma, California. I don't know how many people have heard of Sonoma, California, but when I grew up, it was a small town where we would get film every 6 to 7 months after it premiered in San Francisco. I was always shipped back to Columbia, so I can tell you that I didn't see E.T. for the first 3 years that it aired, and I didn't watch Star Wars until I was literally 22, 23, to the dismay of my boyfriend at the time, and we binge watched it. But it was very much a very rural experience, but an experience that, in retrospect, was preparing me for what is happening in America at this moment. In Sonoma, it was very much a segregated community. You either owned the land or worked the land. It was pretty clear cut. And a lot of the epidemics that we're seeing now in the United States, because Sonoma was changing so quickly, so rapidly, no one was navigating for them. And so when I met Rosario Dawson, who co-founded Voto Latino 10 years ago, I fell in love, because again, it was the very first time I saw a piece of politics celebrating the fact that I was Latina, but recognizing firmly and saying out loud, wholeheartedly, that I was American. I was 29 years old. I had been living in Washington. I had gone and gotten my master's degree as the first person in my family to go to college from the Kennedy School of Government. And it wasn't until I was 29 years old, living in politics, that I had ever recognized, said out loud, that I was American. And that is very much the experience that we see today when it comes to the American Latino experience. Here's a poll that was recently done in the New York Times. This was in June of 2015. The headline screams, the race relations in the US, they're at an all-time low. But if you see who they're polling, it's very much whites and African Americans. I can tell you what's wrong with this poll. The main thing that's wrong with this poll is that it's missing the second largest group of Americans, American Latinos. And every time, 99% of the time, when you read a study about how Americans think, I can guarantee you 99% of that time, we actually don't know how Americans think, because why? We're not talking to the second largest group of Americans. So for the last 15, 20 years, we actually don't know what Americans think. And if we don't know what Americans think, we actually can't solve for big problems or actually look for big picture solutions. As an example, most people in this room, I venture to guess, raise your hand, have heard of the Arab Spring. That was mobilized by the Arab Spring, that was mobilized by Twitter. How many people, raise your hand, don't be shy. But if I were to tell you that in 2006, our country experienced the largest civil rights movement in our nation's history, where 2 million people came and marched in the street peacefully around the country, that was led by this new generation of American Latino Millennials, most people would not know. High schoolers in Los Angeles and Southeast Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Wisconsin, Chicago, New York, marched out of their class, organized via text messaging in MySpace to this. And it's not part of our American consciousness. that these digital natives used MySpace and text messaging, the godparents of Twitter, to mobilize. And why did they mobilize? It was right in December, on the eve of Christmas, that Congress had decided that they were going to do a really very difficult immigration law that was basically going to target these children's parents, sisters, brothers, and grandparents. And they said, not on my watch. And the reason they organized, it was very similar to my experience, that these young people in high school were making decisions for their parents long before they turned 18 years old. They were navigating America, oftentimes simply because they spoke English. But they were negotiating on behalf of their parents and their family members at doctor's offices, translating leases, negotiating salaries, and every once in a while negotiating on their behalf when it came to parent-teacher conferences. I'm guilty of those translations. Most recently, I took my son to the emergency room. He's 2 years old, and he has lived up to his terrible twos in spades. And as he was getting mended, this time it was his toe, there was a young little girl about 2 doors down, and I could hear her voice, and she was translating for her mother that her baby brother, who could not have been more than 6 or 7 months, because I could hear him crying, needed an MRI. She's 9. But she's emblematic of millions of American Latino youth that are basically, again, navigating America for their parents and taking leadership roles. So it was by no surprise that in 2006, when young Latinos heard that their parents are basically going to be beat up by government officials and racially profiled, that they organized themselves and they mobilized the community. And in the last 10 years, we've seen incredible wins with the Latino community. We've seen DACA students, which are basically deferred action students, the ones that you see basically that have chained themselves to the White House and said, I'm American, even though my parents brought me here to this country through no fault of my own. We've also seen great strides when it comes to Hollywood, with Gina Rodriguez as an example. We've seen Lin-Manuel, who has now made the immigrant story of our American roots our story. For those who have not had the chance to see Hamilton, I encourage you to do so. At least at minimum, download it on iTunes. It retells a story of the American history through the eyes of an immigrant and reminds us, in sometimes this very difficult time, what we're made of as Americans and what our possibility is. And yes, we've also had a wise Latina, the very first Latina in the Supreme Court, that basically a couple of weeks ago browbeat, along with her 2 counterparts, the Supreme Court to listen to women's issues. And sometimes people ask, what is the value of diversity? Why should we care about diversity? It is that example of Sonia Sotomayor with Ginsburg and Kagan that basically reminds people that diversity brings perspective and life experience that sometimes is invaluable and above many books. And for the very first time, we also have 2 presidential candidates of Hispanic descent. So the last 10 years have been an incredible opportunity of elevating the Latino community. But it's also been a mixed bag. In the last 10 years, we've had record deportations. Under the Obama administration alone, we've had 2 million people deported, separated from their families and loved ones. Roughly about 100,000 of those caught in the system are actual US citizens. This is a true story. Voto Latino, we're a civic media organization. We're always getting inbound information from different folks from around the country. We got an inbound from a local channel here in Texas. And it was a story that a 13-year-old African-American woman, young girl, teenager, had accidentally been deported to Bogota, Colombia. She had run away, been caught with shoplifting, and basically gave the officials the wrong name on purpose because she didn't want to go home. It turned out that she was on an ICE list, the name that she gave, the fictitious name, on an ICE list for law enforcement. And according to ICE, she was 21 years old. So they deported her. Voto Latino, we worked very closely with Lawrence O'Donnell over at MSNBC, and he was like a dog with a bone. He literally covered the story for 7 days straight until the State Department admitted that, yes, they had wrongfully sent an American citizen who was not Latino, who did not speak Spanish, to another country where she had received working papers. And the beauty of it is that they said, now we want her to pay her flight home. That's ridiculous. So when we say that the system is broken, it's broken not just for undocumented, but it's broken for Americans. In those last 10 years, we've also seen a spike in hate crimes. This is Luis Ramirez. He was 25 years old. He was walking home at night with his Irish wife and ran into 3 young men from high school that basically did not like the fact that he was Mexican. They beat him to death. In the last 10 years, in 2013 alone, 53% of all ethnic hate crimes have been committed against Latinos. Everybody has heard of Black Lives Matter. In 2013 was a tough year for the Latino community. This happened in my hometown. This is Andy Lopez. Andy Lopez was a 13-year-old who was walking around with a toy BB gun in broad daylight, and he was shot to death by two police officers. Within the next week, the whole school district of middle schoolers walked out of their classroom and marched asking for justice for Andy Lopez. Not because he was the first one, but this is a community that has been living with racial profiling all their life, and he's the one that they stood up for. They marched to City Hall, and they were met with the doors closed of the mayor, but with SWAT teams pointing guns at them. You can see the pictures. They were middle schoolers. Everybody here has heard of Donald Trump. I can tell you that the Latino community for the last 10 years have had a great cast of characters that basically predate him. Steve King, the representative for Iowa, who basically said that young Latinos did not deserve relief under DACA because they had calves as big as mules because they carried drugs as they crossed the border. Granted, most DACA recipients came here when they were 2 or 3. We had Jan Brewer, governor of Arizona, who basically condoned racial profiling and passed the state's very first anti-immigration law that swept the country in 23 states. And she said that you can identify an undocumented immigrant simply by the color of their shoes. You can't make it up. Joe Arpaio, who had just recently endorsed Donald Trump, and who has basically been condemned by Amnesty International for gross human rights violations, still remains an incredibly popular person in Arizona. Ann Coulter, who recently named a book called Adios America. I don't need to translate that for you guys, but I'm sure you imagine what that means. And then we have Rush Limbaugh and Lou Dobbs, who for 3 years on CNN kept browbeating, saying that the problems with America were all because you had criminals crossing the border. And as we see these sweeping demographic changes, what we find in the Latino community that is very endemic to other new communities is that they often don't know how to navigate the political process. We have to figure out how to modernize our election systems. One of the new ways to bar people from participating is a time tax. There's no reason why someone needs to stand in line for 8, 9, 10 hours and decide, am I going to cast a vote? Or am I going to go do a day's work so I can put food on the table? But these time taxes are taking place in specific areas where there's a large rising Latino population. In 2013 was a popular year, Shelby County versus Eric Holder came to the Supreme Court. Shelby County, Alabama was the 5th largest growth of American Latino population in 2010, in the last 10 years, the 5th largest. Shelby County basically gutted the Voting Rights Act, the decision by the Supreme Court, gutted the Voting Rights Act and basically excluded free protection for vulnerable populations. If you look at the states, the moment that the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act, Alabama, Texas, Mississippi, South Carolina, and North Carolina. The 5 states that basically had the largest Latino boom from 2000 to 2010 basically all followed suit. In 2014, the very first elections since the gutting of the Voting Rights Act, we experienced here in America the lowest voter turnout in 72 years. It's not by accident. 2016, it's going to be the very first time in US history, in our recent history, 2016, that we don't have voter protection for the most vulnerable of our populations. In Texas, for example, you can now carry a concealed weapon permit, a gun permit, and vote with that. You can't show a student ID and vote. That's not enough. Texas has roughly 3 million eligible voters. Roughly 2 million of them are between the ages of 18 to 35, and also has one of the least likelihoods of actually participating at the polls. And why does this matter? Everybody has heard of the millennials. The millennials are bigger than baby boomers. I love that picture personally of the guy on the telephone. They're bigger than the baby boomers, but the Generation Z is bigger than the millennial generation. This election is going to be the very first, most diverse electorate in our American history, but it's not going to be the last. For the very first time, Generation Z is actually going to be eligible to vote. So we have 17-year-olds among us that are going to be participating for their families. There is an op-ed today in the Florida newspaper called Lakeland. She is a 17-year-old who penned an op-ed and said, this year I'm going to vote because for the last 10 years, my family has been undocumented and I'm the only one eligible. Last year, when President Obama promised my family that they were going to have a shot at DAPA, basically coming out of the shadows for children, for parents who have children who are either DACA recipients or US citizens, but is now being held up in the courts, I'm going to cast a vote for them. She represents millions of young Latinos who are mobilizing for their families. And millennials, they're not spring chickens anymore. A lot of them are going to be aging out of the youth vote this year, when a lot of them are actually 35 years old. So when you start talking about a Generation Z and a millennial generation that collectively are shaping to be the fastest group of Americans and an emerging new group of Americans, we often forget to talk about the generational divide that we're experiencing. So when we hear of these really harsh laws that prevent participation at the polls, when you hear that there's not enough when it comes to justice reform, when it comes to the criminal justice system, when we hear that there's not enough when it comes to pay equity, when we hear that there's not enough when it comes to educational reform or environmental regulation, oftentimes because the people that are in charge are not the actual voter. They don't reflect them. 72 years old is the average age of a US senator today. The average Latino is 27 years old. The wave of the Latino vote is actually right now roughly 14 years old. When we're talking about a tsunami of youth Latino growth, it's not a joke. In the next few years, 80% of all youth between the ages of 11 to 24, 80% are going to be Hispanic. And you right now are in the midst of a political season where people are saying, oh, there's different politicians and they're just, they're Hispandering to the Latino community. My response to that is that they're not Hispandering to the Latino community, they're doing their job. They're going to the community and talking to them. Now, some of them don't do it as gracefully, or they may, they need to get a little more polished. My favorite was 7 things Hillary Clinton has in common with your abuela. And the hashtag that said, Hillary is not my abuela, was fantastic because it didn't connect with the population she was trying to reach. But at least she was trying to reach them. Because then we have this guy. Because we know in the American Latino community that when he says stuff like anchor babies, speak English, go back to Univision, he pretends that he's talking to the undocumented community because that's the safe community to talk to because they're most vulnerable, voiceless, without political power. But the Latino community knows that they're talking about the changing face of America, the American Latino community. And instead of both parties doubling down and taking a step back and saying, not on our watch, you have the Democratic Party kind of taking a step back and saying, oh, let them fall on their faces. And then you have the Republicans saying, oh, you know, I'm not quite sure if I want to say anything right now. And that, unfortunately, creates an incredibly uncomfortable situation around the country. Just this past week, we saw massive rallies, protests that basically stopped Trump in his feet, but in his lane, is that the right one? My ESL comes out every once in a while, guys. Stopped. And what was interesting, though, was when you started seeing who was marching, who was coming out, it was everybody he offended and our allies. It's a new emerging group of Americans that I just mentioned, the most diverse. We had whites, we had blacks, we had African Americans, same thing, African Americans, Asians, Arab Americans, and Latinos, all standing up and saying, not on my watch. But oftentimes part of the narrative that gets lost, and I'm going to read this piece, but oftentimes part of the narrative that gets lost is, what are the repercussions of this hateful speech that's happening in our local communities? This was a piece of a woman close to Washington, D.C. For anyone out there who thinks the racist rhetoric Donald Trump is spewing is harmless, I just got a call from my son's teacher giving me a heads up that 2 of his classmates decided to point out the immigrants in his class who would be sent home when Trump became president. They singled him out and were pointing and laughing at him as one who would have to leave because of the color of his skin. In 3rd grade in Fairfax County in 2016. I could only imagine that little boy. And I could only imagine the powerlessness as a parent that she must have had to have that discussion with her son. My concern with the 2016 election is not about who's going to get elected, sort of, but not really. It's more of what is it doing with our communities where we're increasingly siloed and not realizing that we're actually have the very same vision for where we want to go. When it comes to the Latino community, young Latinas outvote their male counterparts close to by 500,000 folks. When we start talking about why, in 2012, Latinas went out and registered and voted, not only because of the rhetoric of immigration reform, remember we had self-deportation candidate on the ticket, so that helped mobilize, but it was also because we had a battery of a woman's right to choose legislation at the local level across the country. If you recall, I said that the average Latino is 27 years old. That young Latina is in the midst of identifying when she wants to have a family, if she wants to have a family. She is worried about student debt because, unfortunately, student debt does not know gender, but pay equity does. Latinas earn 53 cents on a dollar of a white male counterpart. 53 cents on a dollar is a white male counterpart. In other words, it would take an American of Hispanic descent woman 20 months of work to earn the same as her white male counterpart for the same job. But her student loans are exactly the same as her white male counterpart. And one of the reasons when folks say that Latinos have not come out to the polls to vote in such force is part of the reason is twofold. One is because Latinos are, for the most part, learning about the political process. Oftentimes, they're the first in their families to participate. They are not getting political messages at home. They're not getting them in school. And unlike when I first came to this country, where I learned a lot of my civic duties, believe it or not, on Looney Tunes, because Looney Tunes taught me the power of the vote. They taught me about gun ownership. They taught me about property rights. I only had basically three channels of choice, ABC, NBC, and CBS. Today, this new generation of Americans have a plethora of avenues to gain information. And our job at Voto Latino is trying to figure out how to get that information to this young Latina and this young Latino so that they can participate in the political process, because there are so many decisions, whether it's police profiling, whether it's a woman's right to choose, whether it's pay equity, whether it's environmental disaster. This is a fun, interesting fact, not so fun if you're in Flint, Michigan, but Latinos in Flint, Michigan who were undocumented were refused water because they did not have ID. They didn't even know that there was a crisis in the water system because there was no television or radio that spoke Spanish. They were getting their messages from families in Mexico giving them a call saying your water's contaminated. This is 6 weeks ago. So when we're trying to figure out how to enfranchise the next group of Americans, we have to go where they are, and we have to talk how they talk. And more importantly, we have to use the technology that they crave. Because when you poll them, they are incredibly optimistic about their future. They see themselves as heroes, as healers, as innovators. And Voto Latino, we're trying to make sure that we're meeting them where they are. Because one thing that we also found out about millennials is that cereal is an endangered species. Because washing a bowl, it seems to be too much work. And when we ask them to fill out a form that's 15 minutes too long, they're like, no, thank you. I do not have time. So today, we're very excited to announce that Voto Latino is listening to the millennials, putting it on the palm of their hands, and recognizing that the best way to mobilize a population is not through an organization, but it's through peer-to-peer. And so today we launch VoterPal. VoterPal basically, if you take out your phone, you can download it right now on Apple. It's the first version, but the idea is basically we're going to be able to give you agency to register your friends and your family to vote. You simply ask them to take out their driver's license, you take a picture of their ID, it pre-populates their form, and then we'll send you an email where you can print it out. Now, granted, it's not perfect. Not everybody could meet California or Oregon, where everybody in those two states have automatic voter registration. But we're working on it. This is one way to modernize the form, the voter registration process. And we want you to get involved, and we want you to share it, and we want basically people to have the conversations that if you register, you participate, the politics of today will not be the politics of tomorrow because it is in our hands to define our future. Because collectively, the American Latino community, with the emerging majority of Americans, single white women, African American, youth, and Asian, and Arab Americans all have, for the most part, the same vision of moving forward, and they see and feel that our opportunities are ahead of us. But that is only going to be the case if we recognize that the fight for 15, Black Lives Matter, Occupy Wall Street, a woman's right to choose, and yes, the environment, they are not siloed struggles. And once we recognize that they're not siloed struggles, but that in fact, it is all the same person, that if I care about the environment and I care about a woman's right to choose, and I care about pay equity and equal rights for gays, that I'm not siloed, but we're actually talking about the same thing. You can actually connect the dots of Occupy Wall Street with Black Lives Matter, with the immigration movement, with protesting against crazy legislation that basically tells me when I can choose to have my family. And you'll see many of the same people in the same conversations. And when we realize that we are actually all part of the same vision for our future, that's where we become incredibly strong. And that's when the Latino community is going to rise together with the rest of Americans, because our future is incredibly bright. We're one of the youngest populations in the world. We have some of the best access to healthcare, to education. We own two futures, and we own two paths. A colleague of mine went to Latin America about 2 years ago, and he came back super excited. He was having a conversation with musicians, and he said, this was the coolest thing. He was with a group of friends. His family was from Guatemala, born in East LA, and he had friends from Puerto Rico who were in Michigan, and another friend of his that I want to say Nicaraguan, but he'll correct me later, that was from DC. And they were all in Colombia, all three buddies traveling. And the Colombian musicians were really excited. They're like, you know what? You guys are the coolest. You guys are like super Latinos. And he's like, what do you mean super Latinos? He's like, well, you own the Mayan, the Aztec heritage, but then you also own the landing of the moon, the Steve Jobs Apple. You own both. And in a time when so many young American Latinos are not elevated and feeling powerful, it's an opportunity for us to come together and say, not only are we super Latinos, but we also are part of this American fabric. And in 2006, millions mobilized and marched. And imagine if we have those conversations with our friends and allies, what is it that we cannot do? And so today I also want to share with you the campaign that Voto Latino is launching for 2016, and it's called Brave.
No one ever told me this would be easy, but I never knew that it could be this hard. Oh, the worry, the worry, the worry is weighing on me. Could you help me break down all these question marks and make me fight like a soldier, rise like a warrior, won't stop till the final day. I wanna be stronger, I'm gonna be bolder. Look up and I see the way you make me brave.
Thank you. And with that, I'd love to introduce someone that needs no introduction. She is someone that basically gave me a call about 3 years ago and said, I want to get involved in Voto Latino. And I said, not only are you more than welcome, but she is someone that I have seen own her leadership. And it's an authentic voice that talks from someone who has lived the experiences that I described earlier today, and is someone that I deeply admire, and I cannot imagine having someone else in the trenches with me than America Ferrera.
Hi.
Thank you.
Also, it was 5 years ago.
5 years, put that out there. But every time we talk, we feel like it's 5 years ago.
No, it
right?
feels
It's
like
it's
yesterday.
Yesterday. So America, you've been in South by Southwest earlier. You were talking a little bit about the Latino vote and mobilization. But it's not your first time in Austin. And so I want to talk a little bit about the time you called me and you saw injustice, and you put your cape on.
Yeah. Oh, okay. What were you talking about, UT Austin?
Yes,
Oh, okay,
yes.
okay, yeah. Well, first of all, hi, and thank you to everybody who came to listen to this conversation. I think we could address the elephant in the room and say, it's not a packed house. And I think that's interesting. And I think it's important to acknowledge and to say, this is where we're at with this conversation. This is the level of interest that lies in the midst of so many conversations being had. And without making a judgment on it, I think it's important to just acknowledge and say, you know, some people are showing up for the conversation and some people aren't. And so thank you to those of you who did show up. Now, about the conversation. I first got involved with Voto Latino after I'd already started getting politically involved in a very partisan, very specific, out there for a very specific candidate kind of way. And what I saw when I was on the ground was that it was bigger than one candidate. It was bigger than one election. It was about this sleeping giant of a community. I think 27 million Latinos are eligible to vote, and yet we're not showing up. And so does it really matter who gets elected this year if inside of our community we aren't learning to show up for ourselves and then hold those elected officials accountable for the things that impact our lives? And so that's when I reached out to Maria Teresa and Voto Latino and said, how do we solve this problem? And luckily, they'd already been on the case for years and years
But
and
we
years.
haven't solved the problem. That's why we need each and every one of you.
But they were definitely on the case, and seeing the issue and the solution through the eyes of the young Latinos in this country, who are a lot like young Americans in general, But what's particular about this population is that they are, as MT said, natural born leaders or made to become leaders very quickly in their homes and with their families. And so how do we translate that to leaders in their community? And the incident that Maria Teresa is talking about is something that happened right here in Austin on the UT campus. What year was this?
2013. 2013 was a wild year.
It was 2013, and I started seeing on my Twitter feed a bunch of tweets from kids on the UT campus saying, America, they're planning a Catch an Immigrant Day on UT, where I think it was the Young Republicans, I don't want to misspeak, yep. The Young Republicans on the campus planned a game where some of them would wear a white t-shirt that says, I'm an immigrant. And if you manage to catch one of them and bring them back, you would get a gift certificate to Jamba Juice. So sort of a very hostile, aggressive game with a message that made a lot of people on the campus feel attacked and unsafe. And so, of course, my blood is boiling, and in the moment I call MT and say, what do we do about this? There are these kids who are afraid enough for their own safety and their own environment on a college campus. UT, which I think has the largest undocumented student body in the country.
Right.
How is this happening in Austin?
The bastion of liberalism of Texas.
In Texas. So I got on a plane the next day. With Voto Latino, we tried to rally as many young people on the campus as possible to come out and speak against and protest this game. And kind of what was unfortunate was that the administrators and the adults on this campus weren't responding to these cries, to these pleas for help of, are you really gonna allow this to take place when it makes so many of us on this campus feel unsafe and invisible and unprotected and unseen? And so one of the reasons why I think it's so important that Voto Latino was there to respond to these young people is that if it's happening on the UT campus in Austin, this is happening on campuses across the country. And there are young people who are feeling unsafe and their voices are not being responded to. Their voices are not being heard. And that is bad. That's bad for America. That's bad for all of us.
Well, it talks a little bit about the pressure that we heard, right? That 9-year-old kid that came home crying saying, my friends are pointing me out and saying I'm different based on the color of my skin. It's almost like we're repeating history all over again, and no one is talking about it because the folks that they're talking about and they're dehumanizing is a group of Americans that no one talks about, right? Like,
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think that we're not having the conversation on a national level. Not only what is this doing to young brown students and how does that make them feel and how does that change their involvement and the way they feel about being in America, but also what is this engendering in Americans? Why are we going backwards? Why are we emboldening people's worst qualities to come out and protect those qualities and say, you know, it's your right to make another student feel unsafe on campus?
Well, and I want to talk a little bit about that because one of the most compelling stories I heard from why you wanted to get involved was your own experience with a conversation similar that you had to have your mom when you were a little girl. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I was in first grade growing up in California, and where I grew up, like all of my friends were immigrants or first generation. So I had my Arab friends who were American, but their parents came from the Middle East. I had Chinese friends who were Americans, but their parents were from China. I had Filipino friends. Like, I just thought that was part of being American, was we're all Americans. We go home and speak another language and eat different kinds of things for breakfast, but at the end of the day, that's what makes us. It's not in spite of that, but that is actually what makes us American. And when I was in first grade, there was a proposition up for vote, Prop 187, which was a very aggressive proposition that would allow young kids like me in elementary school to be asked and brought in for questioning of the status of my family. I mean, I was in first grade.
And that was basically, yeah, right. And Proposition 187 was basically the precursor to all the legislation and model legislation that was done by Jan Brewer in 2010 by Arizona.
Right. And I was born in the USC hospital, raised in the San Fernando Valley. Like,
Your
I'm
name's
a Valley
America.
girl. My name is America. And my mom had to take me aside and say, you don't have to answer any questions. You don't have to defend yourself. You don't have to fight for your right to be like every other student in this classroom. And so if someone asks you a question you don't want to answer, don't answer it. And what I realized in that moment was, why am I having to have this conversation? Like, why isn't my friend Jordan having this conversation with her mom? And why isn't my friend Ashley having this conversation with her mom? Why am I all of a sudden feeling so different? And that wasn't something that I'd felt growing up. And that was one of the first times that I felt other. And one of the first times where I, was afraid, and not that I understood the proposition, and that I understood really much of any of it. I mean, I understand so much about it now than I did when I was that first grader being told by my mom to, not answer any questions that I didn't feel comfortable answering. But what I did understand and what I did know was that something was happening to me that wasn't happening to my peers, and it was based on the color of my skin and where my parents came from.
And now in your profession, you use it as an opportunity to tell stories. But most recently, Hollywood has had this huge backlash because of the lack of diversity. And I think the lack of diversity in Hollywood really stems, I think, to, and we have this conversation all the time, like the massive generational shift of power that's happening. So in Congress, the average senator is 72 years old. When you look at who is manning the Oscars, for the most part, they're older white males. The same thing can be said for newsrooms. The same thing you could say with Silicon Valley when it comes to VC, who's funding, who are the VCs. And the same thing can be said for, thank you. And the same thing can be said for Wall Street. So why, how have you been able to use your voice to have a conversation within Hollywood to basically talk to them about the need for these different stories that at the end of the day shape our perception of who Americans are?
Well, I think that there isn't a single answer to that. And I think my entire career, whether I've asked for it or not, I've been having to have these conversations, from like getting a role that maybe was written stereotypically and then trying to find a way to infuse that role with more depth and more humanity and more realness. And how do I have a conversation with the writer about what my experience of being this person is? And some of those conversations are really hard to have. And now, as a producer who I have the ability to develop stories and create space for storytellers that may not be easily accessible to them, I can have that conversation on a different level, in the creation. And I really do believe, that it's going to change, not just in Hollywood, but in everywhere, when we have different voices representing different experiences in positions of decision making. And what's so hard about Hollywood is there's no math or science for how people get into positions of power and decision making. But I look at the world of politics, and there is a math and science. It's called elections. It's called voting. Like, we can't go there and demand that studios hire more Latinos, but we can demand that our representatives in elected office represent our backgrounds, whether we're Latino, Black, Asian, woman, gay, whatever. We actually do have a math and science of electing people in who represent us and electing people out who don't. And so that's why I feel like this work is so empowering to me, because there's an answer. We just need to resource and give people the proper tools and educate them and ask them to be a part of the conversation.
That's absolutely right. And I think one of the things that we take for granted oftentimes is that people, I always hear, well, there's just too much money in politics, and it's, it's too corrupt. And my answer to that is like, you're right, there's a lot of money in politics, but the people writing those checks are still going to the voting booth. They recognize that the voting booth is the equalizer. You go into that booth, you close the curtain, And that booth, that ballot has no idea how much money you have. They have no idea your ethnicity. They don't have your sexual preferences. They don't know. It's actually the one thing still that is literally colorblind.
And I also think, sorry to interrupt you.
No.
I also think a conversation that is so basic but needs to be had is so many people are like, voting doesn't matter. It doesn't really matter. Like, my vote doesn't count. And look, that's a very big conversation about the way that people are elected in our country, and especially when it comes to presidential elections. It's so elusive to so many of us how it actually works. But when I get on the ground, like, I just came from a town in called Waukegan, Illinois, an hour north of Chicago, where the population is largely black and brown. They just elected their first ever Latino councilman. Like, that's how, in 2015, like, that's how long it took for even one person in their city council to come from the background that the majority of the people in this town are. And in those local elections, those people who are being elected into those positions actually have so much more direct impact on the daily lives of the people living in that town. And I covered a story on a group of people trying to shut down a coal plant that is making their children sick. It's poisoning them. And the people in office aren't listening to them and aren't paying attention, most likely because they themselves are not impacted by the poisoning. And so when you look at an issue like that, it only becomes more and more clear and urgent how important it is that we show people that their votes do matter. And whether they show up to elect people who represent them makes a real and actual and tangible difference in their lives.
Well, and what happens when you actually elect elected officials that look like you, right? So in Nevada, in 2007, it was the very first time in Nevada that a Latino was elected to the state office house. In 2007, within that, they've had over, I want to say 10 Latinos elected, and they've actually been able to address the issues that the community needs. So they were able to provide free lunch programs, driver's license for undocumented, just a whole host of issues that before was not even on folks' radars. And sometimes it's because politicians, I always like to say, the 72-year-old senator, their grandchildren are not in the classroom with millennials kids, right? They're just not. So how can you address big policy issues if you're never even going to see each other? And that's why electing a group of a body that actually looks like the population is so critically important.
And understands the experience, understands the day-to-day experience of what we are dealing with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I know we have some time, and we want to actually open it up for questions. I think there's a mic over there. If you can just please say where you're from and your name, that would be great. And thank you for coming.
Hi there. My name is Wendy de la Rosa. I'm a Dominican, and I have two quick questions. You talked a lot on this panel about holding people accountable. And I think when I think about President Obama, who ran on a campaign, Yes We Can, stealing Dolores Huertas, Si Se Puede, promising that he's going to change and pass immigration reform in any meaningful way, and then being the president that has supported the most number of undocumented immigrants, how has Voto Latino held him accountable for that? Because I feel like a lot of the messaging, both in 2008 and 2012, has been to support, President Obama.
Yeah. So I actually think this is actually where America and I, we met. We were actually at a private conversation with a few other folks, a roundtable discussion with President Obama. And this was on the eve of, this was 2011, and it was after immigration was not passed the first time. And he basically said, you're going to have to hold politicians accountable. And I brightly said, that's Democrats and Republicans. And he's like, well, let's talk about it. And I think that's how we became friends, because we recognize that until we have politicians that are basically friendly to our families, our vote is up for grabs. That said, one of the conversations we've learned as a community in the last 8 years is that it's not enough to have someone in power at the White House. We actually need to have folks that are in Congress and in the Senate to participate. No one's talking about the 2016 election for what it is. It's an opportunity, one, to identify U.S. senators that are friendly to our policies. but it's also an opportunity to make a dent in Congress. If we participate this year, and we are able to take some congressional seats back that are friendly to us, what's on the map in 2020 is redistricting. One of the reasons why you currently have roughly 48 members of Congress who are of the Tea Party holding Congress hostage is that they've carved out through gerrymandering their districts where it actually doesn't matter how they vote, but they're holding the Republican Party hostage. When we're looking at voting in 2016 and 2018, it's making sure that we're not only voting in Congress, but also in our elected officials, so that we can actually start identifying state legislators that can actually make dents when it comes to redistricting. That is the elephant in the room. It's actually not who's going to hold the office in the next 4 years. It's actually how are we participating in record numbers so that we can actually have a stake at what the next 15 years of America is going to look like in congressional districts. Because that's what the last 10 years taught us. And let's also be clear that the other thing that's at stake is the Supreme Court. Right now, we have before the Supreme Court issues on the environment, issues on a woman's right to choose, immigration, and we also have the issues of affirmative action, and I can go on through a whole host of things. The average age, of the 8 remaining justices, there's 4 of them that are 76 or older. 76 or older. Now is an opportunity for us to have the conversations of, yes, it's about looking at the White House, but it's actually looking at what else we're going to need and the reforms we're going to need and the people that are going to need to advocate on our behalf to make sure that we're changing that conversation.
And I would add to that as well that, I think the conversation that doesn't just need to happen with Latinos, but all Americans and young Americans and old Americans is if we wanted to show up at the ballot box and vote for someone and then check out for 4 years, which is what a lot of us do, that is leaving a vacuum of power and void, and a void that gives a blank check to the people we elect in office, and we shouldn't give them that blank check. We need to organize and educate ourselves in a way that we're showing up not just for election day, but holding our local elected officials accountable when our health clinics are shutting down, when US-born citizens are being refused their birth certificates because local legislation is blocking it. So we can have the bigger conversation about the president and, but we voted for this president and he didn't change everything for us. But we have to be there for all the other choices and all the other pivotal moments where if we don't raise our voices, we're leaving it to money in politics to define the choices that people in office make. And we have to stay present. We have to stay loud. We can't just go back to sleep after we voted on November 4th.
Thank you. I think we all bear that responsibility to stay engaged throughout. And the last thing I wanted to just say, and it's really not a question, but thank you for at least highlighting the similarities between Black Lives Matter movement and the Latino movement. Because as someone who was born and raised in the Dominican Republic, my last name is De La Rosa Felipe. When I walk into Austin, I'm a Black woman, and I've been frustrated at some members of the Latino community not recognizing that that is also our struggle. So I loved the campaign. Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Kate. I want to say thank you so much for talking about gerrymandering, because that was actually my question. So you answered my question before I got up here. So instead, I want to ask about this election and specifically the conversation that's happening in the Republican Party. And it has to be incredibly frustrating that after 2012 and the autopsy report and how they were supposed to be restructuring to be more inclusive, I'm just interested in your take and kind of the lack of choice that there is for a lot of us when it comes to this presidential election.
So this is the very few moments where I say that the Republican Party is not giving a woman her due, right? Everybody likes to say that Trump came spoof out of nowhere, and they actually built this beginning with Sarah Palin. And Sarah Palin was the first person, and she deserves her due because she is part of the reason why we're here today. Fox News, for 15 years, if you're piping into people's homes as their neighborhoods and communities are changing, and no one is explaining to them, but instead are basically piping in saying that government is broken, political officials are corrupt, you can't trust anyone, they get a Donald Trump who's basically an outsider, claiming to respond to them. For the Republican Party, I would encourage them to read their autopsy report, because in that it said, as you inferred, that you can't win without single women, and you can't win without African Americans, and you really can't win without American Latinos, like if you don't have them on your side. And what I found the most disappointing is that they've basically doubled down, and they said that regardless of who their candidate is, they're going to go ahead and support them. They've created the revolution from within, and if they want a shot at the Latino vote and our allies, they actually have to stand up and say, this is not the America we want. You have to tone down the temperature, and you actually have to have leadership. And that's, I think that is the most frustrating part when it comes to the Latino community. It's not just the rhetoric, but it's the hate speech and the currents that are now impacting people's communities.
And also, the Latino vote is not a monolith.
No.
All Latinos don't have the same values. And what is mind-boggling to me about the Republican Party is that they could have a real in with the Latino vote. You know, there was a time when Republican debates included comprehensive immigration reform, and where, you know, George Bush Sr. and Ronald Reagan were talking about Latino immigrants as vital to our economy. And so it's not that Latinos are somehow naturally non-Republicans, but when you are saying the things you're saying that are absolutely racist, absolutely xenophobic, and inspiring and emboldening violence and hatred towards our community, what choice do you give us? That's always going to be more important to us than, you know, a political stance that we may actually agree with you on. So at a certain point, it's like they all made a decision they were just going to write off the Latino vote, instead of any of the candidates realizing that they could have actually received support by Latino Republicans by going against the hateful speech.
Yeah. I mean, this is the very first time that a cohort of Latino Republicans have stood out and done multiple public announcements and press conferences saying that if Trump is the nominee, that they cannot support them. These are folks that are Republican operatives that worked for the Bush administration, that worked for the Pentagon. I mean, you have them all across the board. They're saying, you guys have to stop. And this is people from within their party.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Veronica. I'm from DC.
Hi,
I work for AARP, so I love the shout out to the baby boomer in the slide. I have a question about Brave, the video you showed, and I love the content. It looks great. So it's a two-part question. One, is that Selena Gomez singing on the track?
No.
Who is that?
Mariah Peters.
Oh, okay.
You haven't heard of her, but we hope you will.
Yeah, I haven't heard of her, so I was just curious whose voice that was. And then second, I was wondering if you could speak to the deployment of that content, like the media buy that you're doing, or the strategy around the fact that Latinos over-index on mobile, and they over-index on Droid usage too. So, you know, just kind of like how you're going to deploy that across channels.
Yeah, so Vote Latino, we've always been a digital-first strategy organization, and it wasn't because we had foresight, it's because we didn't have any money, right? So when we started. So everything that we do is digital-first. We have identified several different partners that will help us. So for example, Apple Music is one of our partners. We're partnering with Live Nation as well. So basically, we're working with about 15 artists that are donating a concert, and each concert we're going to have a booth. We actually want to know what makes you brave. And the idea is that we want to know what makes you brave, because that's the way you can stand up. And with Voter Pal, not only will you stand up, but you're going to register your friends and your families as well. This election is all about numbers. As America was saying, we actually know the math of what we need in order to get there, but one organization alone cannot do it. We recognize that in 2012, everybody was giving each other high fives because collectively the campaigns and organizations like Vote Latino registered 620,000 people. Awesome. 800,000 people turned 18 that year. 800,000. So the only way that we can actually do this is for Brave to become viral. We need your help. We are identifying also not just activists such as America, but also different social media celebrities, local radio DJs. They've been part of our coalition now for 10 years. We'll be working closely with them. But at the end of the day, it's peer-to-peer, mouth-to-mouth. And the more people talk about it, the more they see themselves in this conversation. You ask about media buy. Voto Latino, we are working on media buys. We've never really done media buys because we're very organic and small. But we welcome free, gratis media buys if you want to give us to us. Nothing is too small for us. But thanks for your question.
Yeah, and so if we want to share that,
Yes.
like peer-to-peer on our own networks, we could go to YouTube for Voto Latino and share that video.
So yeah, so this is basically, you guys are seeing a preview. We're actually going to launch it with a different video. This was just the rough cut. And once we have that, we will share it with you guys. And if you give me your card, if you give me your card or you ping us, then we'll definitely make sure that you're on that list.
Definitely, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for the panel. It's really great, and the room should be full. We can see what people are afraid of, I think. My question is about, you referred to money in politics, and I'm wondering what you are thinking about the Koch brothers funded Libre initiative.
That's a good question. So I think, the Koch brothers have basically have taken the Karl Rove playbook. And for those folks who are not familiar with Karl Rove, he was a special advisor to the president, President Bush, and basically discovered that he didn't need all constituencies. He just basically, President Bush, in order to win the White House, he basically needed to skim from the top. He needed a certain sector of Latinos, a certain sector of African Americans, a certain sector of gays, and a certain sector of the Jewish community. Fast forward to the Koch brothers, in my opinion, is that they've taken that and doubled down on steroids. There is a reason why the Koch brothers are very interested right now in criminal justice reform for the African American community. And there's a reason why they're very interested in the Latino vote and doing the Libre initiative. So the Libre initiative basically goes into immigrant communities and promises, in some cases, food for vote in a very crass way. They will literally give you, teach you how to speak English, they will teach you how to take your citizenship test, and they will also give you food. And it's a way to cultivate a group. I find it, look, the Latino community there's so much need in the Latino community when it comes to navigating America. But I also find it sometimes disingenuous because they say one thing to the Latino community and then say another. As an example, they claim that they don't believe in a minimum, they claim that a minimum wage is actually something, a fair wage is actually something that is a terrible thing for the Latino community. You know what? The majority, 22% of those who earn a minimum wage are heads of household Latinas. It is a living wage is actually an opportunity for you to get out of poverty. My concern is that they want to obfuscate their intentions and as a result are not being completely forthcoming. I have no problem with different political views as long as you are forthcoming and you stand by what you stand by what you say. But when you don't, and there's plenty of other folks on the right that are basically sometimes even kind of like shrug their shoulders, that's the challenge. I think we only have a couple of minutes for a couple of questions, so you'll be the last one.
I'm Danielle Duran. I'm from New Mexico. And we have in northern New Mexico a really strong history of being politically active and in control of our own political destiny. And I wasn't going to ask a question, but right as you were talking about local races, my dad texted me and said, "Oh, honey, everybody missed you at the local county convention. They asked where you were." And I thought every single Hispanic in this country should feel like that they should be at their county convention, they should be voted in as delegates, they should be their local representative, and I just want to know how we can help you make that happen.
Well, I think first you sign up to votolatino.org and you sign up to be a volunteer. And it's so funny. I always joke with my husband. So my husband is half Indian American. And we joke because he says, I keep teasing him, I said, you know all the Indian Americans in this country, and he jokes that you know all the Latinos in this country. And it's sort of true because we have vast networks. And when it comes to mobilization, as was presented during the immigration marches, what we found is that by networking with each other, we actually make change. And now more than ever, it's important for us to be having those conversations. For the very first time at Voto Latino, we are constantly busting our butt trying to get different partnerships. For the very first time, our office has been inundated with partnerships. We've had people coming in from Live Nation, Instagram, Google, Me Too. People who normally we would have to chase down are actually knocking on our door. And the reason why is that for the very first time, you have Latino leadership that are peers that's saying, you know what about what we can do to contribute? So I love your question, and I really kind of throw it back at you. It's like, what can you do? Like, how can you help us so that we can basically disseminate the Brave campaign, disseminate Voter Pal, make sure that people realize that at the end of the day, registering to vote is not rocket science, but we actually do need you to participate.
So I already typed my county clerk and hopefully soon to be Secretary of State and said, when are we going to get Voter Pal? And she said she would look into it. So.
Well, I think that's what's so exciting to me about this app that we're here launching today, which is it's giving anybody the tool to become an organizer. Anyone who's ever sat at home and asked the question, you know, how do I engage? How do I help? This is a tool to do that. And to download the app on your phone, go to your communities, go to your churches, go to, you know, the local Little League sports games and start asking people, are you registered to vote? Let me help make it easier for you. And I just want to say quickly, I said this on the last panel I was on, and I want to say it again because I think this has to be where we go with this conversation. The importance of Latinos voting in America is not a Latino issue. It is an American issue. And when more of us are represented, when more of us who have the same values show up, that's when things are going to change. So it's wonderful that there are so many Latinos in here, but it's also wonderful that there are so many of you who are not Latino being part of this conversation. Back in 2012, I worked with Voto Latino on getting the Latino vote out. And I tell people, oh, I'm working with Voto Latino, and they'd be like, oh, that's so sweet. Oh, that's so cute for Latinos. That's so good. And then after Obama won the election, I got emails and phone calls from my non-Latino friends saying, thank you. I get it. If the Latinos hadn't showed up, Obama might not have won. So thank you. And regardless of where you stand in politics and whether that was a happy day for you or not, the point is that Latinos showing up for Latinos is only a small part of the conversation. The bigger conversation is that we have the power to impact the larger national conversation that impacts everyone in this room and all of us. So this app is not for Latinos. This app is for everyone and anyone who's interested in turning their phone into a registration drive. And that's what's so incredibly exciting about the democratic nature of technology and what Voto Latino is doing to tap into it.
Right, and with it, this is actually one of multiple phases. So what you have right now, you're able to download. We're going to be building upon it. But right now what you can do is basically also see all the people that you've registered. And I would encourage you guys to challenge each other. How many people can you register? And we will be keeping tabs, and we can actually be able to work with you on that. So are there any other questions? No, actually we ran out of time. So thank you so much for being so thoughtful and being so attentive. And thank you, America.
Yeah.
And thank you, South by Southwest.